Hello, and welcome to Education Leadership for a Digital World, a Digital Promise webinar series supported by the Wallace Foundation. I'm Frederick Brown, the Chief Learning Officer and Deputy at Learning Forward, and today's webinar is Professional Learning Communities, an opportunity to move the needle on equity. Our expert panelists today are Dr. Doug Fisher, Professor of Educational Leadership at San Diego State University, and Bryan Dale and Marnitta George, teachers at Health Sciences High and Middle College in San Diego. And today we'll discuss how we can be intentional about integrating equity into professional learning communities. So thank you for joining us, Bryan, Marnitta, and Dr. Fisher.
Hello, welcome, hi.
Thank you for having us.
Good morning.
These are exciting times and interesting times for schools. And we all know that because we're all living on the front lines of public education. And so before I ask my first question, I want to remind our participants to please add your questions to the Q&A section. As we hear from our panelists, I'm sure a couple of questions are going to come up. So in the Q&A section, because it's from there and not the chat box, that we'll be pulling questions for our panel. So again, if you have questions for the panel, use the Q&A section. So to get us started, I'm gonna, Doug, come to you and just ask if you could just give us a quick review of PLCs. Take us back to the 70s. What was the original intention and where are we now?
Great, thanks. So yeah, the 70s, that's kind of where this all started to really happen. I suspect that teachers were feeling kind of isolated and maybe they had informal relationships, but for some reason in the 70s, there was this coalescing of teachers could come together and they could think about, talk about, plan what they wanted their kids to learn and actually share with each other who's learning, who's not learning, and what they can do about it. And that original idea of professional learning communities was that the grown-ups had to learn stuff too, so that the kids could learn more. And the idea was that none of us are as good alone as we could be together, that there was this power in the collective, that you might have a really good idea about reaching a kid that I just hadn't thought of yet. And then I might have a really good, assessment or assignment or task that we could share and look at and improve and implement. So the idea was coming together could make us better. Now, as a result, the whole field has been studying collective efficacy since then. 35 years ago, we started seeing some emergence of this collective efficacy, which is super popular. I mean, Bandura put it out there in the world before that, but then in education, it became really, really popular, kind of fell out of favor. And then when John Hattie put it on the list as, high effect size, it became popular again. And that, I think, was the impetus to form this idea of professional learning communities.
As I read the standards for professional learning, and in particular the learning community standard, it reads, professional learning that increases educator effectiveness and results for all students occurs within learning communities, or what we would say are professional learning communities, committed to continuous improvement. And you just made this point about collective responsibility or collective efficacy and goal alignment. And I'm curious, based on what you just said, and as you're looking at districts, particularly since the 70s to now, in your view, in what ways are districts or schools struggling or succeeding in living that definition?
Well, I think we kind of lost our way in a little bit, and it became not about grown-up learning, and it became solely about student learning. And I do think we're all here for students to learn. I mean, that's why we're in this enterprise. But I think in the last decade or so, there's been a neglect of the grown-ups learning. So what ends up happening is you have professional development sessions. As Learning Forward says, let's stop calling them professional development, let's call it professional learning. But what you still see are professional development sessions divorced from professional learning communities. And in the PLC, the only thing that's talked about is what do kids need to learn, who learned it, and what you're going to do about it. We don't, in most places, we forgot that a professional learning community could also impact the learning of the grown-ups, that could be a very intentional part of the learning community's effort.
And Marnitta and Bryan, as you're hearing this, I'm wondering, are those words resonating with you? Marnitta, what you're thinking in your head? What's in
I
your
know.
mind?
Well, I started teaching within that time period that Doug just mentioned, that 10 years ago or so time. And those times within our PLCs were, again, just about the data and the numbers. And instead of focusing on really how can we, or what strategies can we employ so that our students will benefit from this, it became almost a struggle to focus on teacher growth, and became only how can my students grow here. And so personalities were removed. When we think about equity, when we think about our classroom practices that really impact the students, and students were really only looked at as their numbers, and teachers were too. And so I experienced that firsthand, and I appreciate, Doug, you mentioned in that that time span. I started teaching in that. So that was a struggle to learn and grow as an educator, and have the opportunity to continue to work on and take those risks, because that time period of learning or growing was removed from teachers during that time.
Yeah, that's and Bryan, I saw you had some shakes of the head as well. What was going through your mind?
Oh, it's an interesting concept, especially since I'm a little bit newer to the profession, and my experiences as a whole has been a little bit different. That I didn't get to see this side where people are a little bit closed off or closed-minded, and we didn't get to think about our own growth as educators. The school site in which I work at, we spend a lot of time talking to one another, working with one another in order to grow our practice, all for the purpose of, the benefit of our students. So it's very interesting to hear the history of PLCs and how maybe the concept was lost at one point, and it's neat to know that it's found now.
As you're talking and mentioning the fact that this happened so many years ago, and I'm thinking back to, I was actually teaching in the classroom and was one of those folks who was isolated back in the 80s and not being able to connect with my fellow teachers around our practice. So it's good to hear that in many places we've gotten past that. But Doug, I'll come back to you. I know one of the purpose of this webinar is to make that connection between PLCs, instruction, and equity. And how they come together. And I'm curious, just getting to the role of instruction, what role should conversations about instruction play in professional learning communities from your perspective?
Well, I think that as part of the conversation that groups of teachers have, they should talk about how to move learning forward. That should be part of the natural conversation. How do you move learning forward? Well, it's with instruction, right? That's the name of your organization. How do we move learning forward is by having experiences for students. And I believe, and I've been trained in several PLC models, we were not allowed to talk about instruction. We were talking about what kids needed to learn and creating common formative assessments. So I had experiences, and I remember one from years ago. I was working at an elementary school, and we had our grade level meeting, and we talked about the standards. We unpacked and repacked them, and we had our common formative assessment, and then we all left to go teach it the best way we knew how. And one of my colleagues thought that building reading comprehension could occur through round robin reading, and implemented a malpractice, a really bad practice, because we never talked about it. We only talked about, okay, here's the reading comprehension standard, here's the assessment comment that we're gonna give. We never talked about instruction. And as a result, that person's students suffered. And then weeks later, when we brought the data back together, there was not growth. And then we had to say, oh, now your kids are gonna go to intervention. Now they need to catch up that while the rest of us move on. And that simple action prevented his students from moving forward in their learning. Now I want to caution this, that the professional learning communities can't only talk about instruction. There are other things we need to talk about. But I think the neglect of a conversation on instruction is problematic. That there's evidence-based practices that we could share with each other. I mean, if you've had success in the past, like if I change grade levels and if I join Marnitta and Bryan in their grade level and I haven't taught that grade level in a while, they have some knowledge about teaching that year, that grade, that content that I might not have. We do this to elementary teachers a lot. You know, you're teaching 3rd grade, but next year you're teaching 5th grade. And maybe you need some support from your colleagues, even though you're a very strong teacher. What happens in 5th grade? And how are we moving learning forward in 5th grade versus what we did in 3rd grade or 1st grade? So I think teams need to have some time to talk about what works. How do we know it's going to work instructionally?
I was trying to count how many times you said learning forward, but I lost count. So hey, thank you for that. But as Bryan and Marnitta, as you were hearing this, because part of what I heard from Doug was we've got to make time to talk about instruction and about the curriculum and about instruction materials and how those will be used. That's what I took from those remarks. And I'm curious if one of you can speak to, so how do those conversations look and happen in your PLC experience? Who wants to jump on that one first?
Well, it's a trade that we have to continue to practice. You know, we're always going to grow and there's always going to be something new to incorporate into what we do within the classroom. And the PLCs that I've been a part of, we've used things like videotaping each other just briefly, micro recording each other within lessons, or even classroom observations are a way that we're able to witness each other teach and then bring that information back into our communities to have these conversations about. You know, it could be from a growth mindset of, hey, I kind of struggling in this area and I want you guys to come into my classroom and watch me, or I've had a lot of success and I want to share this with you and maybe you can incorporate that into your own classroom. And that's kind of just what's been my own experience is at the school site that I'm at right now.
Yeah, that's powerful. Marnitta, what would you add to that?
Just adding that, just like Bryan is reminding us, that transparency that's there and that trust that has been developed within those teams. And really, when we think about a cohort and when we want to work and plan together, we do, as educators, we want to trust that we are supported and that we are nurtured and that we're given kind of leave to take risks that we believe will best help our practice. And when we think about those micro teaching, I mean, how it's really scary for a teacher to videotape themselves and put it out there for other colleagues to see and to critique. And so when we think about those strategies and those practices that help us get better, it's really just being transparent and trusting that our colleagues are there with our best interests in mind, of course, to better help all of our students that we share collectively and that we support. So asking those tough questions and allowing ourselves to hear those tough answers as well.
So Fred, as Marnitta was talking, I was reminded of something else. As part of the conversation on instruction, and as they're talking about recording and sharing recordings and visiting each other's classrooms, we can also look at the assignments with students. It's rare in most PLCs to actually do an assignment analysis. And, you know, we tend to talk about, okay, so global, here are the big standards we're going to teach. And we tend to talk about the assessments, not the assignments. And if you read the research on this, somewhere around 17% assignments are actually at grade level in the United States, about 17%. Average, okay, so right, so there are schools that get higher and lower, but in like TNTP's work and the opportunity gap, if you look at that, somewhere around 17% are grade level assignments. And you may think you have very high expectations for kids, but when you bring it to your group and you say, here's the assignment I'm going to give to get to this level of standard, of mastery of the standard, and your colleagues say, wait, we need to have a conversation about that. If they achieve that, it would be awesome if they were in 4th grade, but we're in 8th grade now. And so, you know, a really, really amazing lesson for 7th graders on 5th grade standards produces 8th graders who are good at 6th grade. And so when we never come back together to look at the tasks and assignments we give, we're also doing a disservice with our instruction. So I don't know if Bryan or Marnitta want to talk about any task assignment analysis work you've done at school.
I know that we've we've used a protocol not too long ago at our school site in which we bring lessons in, and it would incorporate some of the videotaping and observation aspect, but it would also have us bring in student samples and the work that we had set up for the lesson itself. And spending that time and talking with, you know, the 12th grade, I teach 9th and 10th grade English. So being able to talk with the upper division English teachers and share my insights and my experiences with the lessons that I've developed and get their expertise and their eyes, the lenses that they bring, it's extremely beneficial. It's that the idea of like a, you know, a community of learners teaching other learners ultimately, that is real special.
Absolutely. And again, Bryan is speaking to the power of vertical alignment. And when we work with our different grade level teams, and we learn the gaps, right? Or where at each grade level, we may, as Doug mentioned, maybe we're not meeting the appropriate grade level standards. And so if we sit down as a collective and we really do bring in these assignments and say, hey, I have all of my kids did great on this assignment, you guys. This was a powerful one. Let me tell you what I created and let me share with you the results. But then if the 11th or 12th grade teacher takes a look at this task and they question how can students move from 10th to 11th grade doing work like this, that's a reflective moment, and also a time for your colleagues to help. So again, I mentioned nurturing again. Although we all work together and we're colleagues, we focus on this nurturing environment where we're, again, able to take the risk and feel free to take the risk and follow up with the research so that we can try again and go at it again.
The need for communication through everyone.
You know, you may have heard this before, but I learned everything I need to learn about how to teach. And this idea of PLCs is just something extra that I don't have time for. But that's a belief that's out there. And this question came from one of our attendees. How do you combat that belief? It's just everything you're talking about sounds well and good, but there's something extra, and I don't have time for that. How would any of one of you panelists respond to this notion of don't give me something else to do?
Yeah,
I think
and I mean, that's real. That the reality is that many educators are pulled in several different directions, wear multiple hats or several committees, and there's one more meeting to attend. And I mentioned this before, we spent a lot of time, we had a really new PLC this year. We spent a lot of time at the beginning of the year really just laying that foundation of trust. We looked at our own beliefs and practices. We opened the discussion to share those beliefs and practices, and then we were able to come as a team and say, hey, you guys, what will our goals be this year as a team? What will we work towards together to better impact the learning of our students? And so Doug mentioned it early when this conversation started. Sometimes you gotta really isolate the discussion on the students from the teachers, and so we were able to spend some time focusing on ourselves and where we wanted to go so that we can help build that efficacy to learn and to grow and to reach our own standards of success. And so we actually, Bryan, we did a couple of book readings. They weren't challenged or set out by the school. It was just we got to that place as a team where we still wanted to learn and grow together. Even since we've been on quarantine, we just read Stamp
during this time.
By
We had like a little
Reynolds.
book club.
Yeah, we made a book club, but we got to that place where it wasn't a chore. It was, again, that goal that we had together. We're like, hey, you guys, here's the problem. We want to make sure our students, their voice is heard, and let's read this text. Let's just see if we can apply anything to our classrooms from this. And we did it.
So I'm hearing a couple of words in what you're saying. One, trust is really important. And when you're making your own practice, you're being vulnerable, you're sharing what you believe with others and colleagues. So creating that sense of trust. And one of the questions that's come up and from our participants is, where's the school leader in all of this? And so I'll ask the question in two ways. One, what's the role of the principal in professional learning communities? Like, what role do they play in creating that culture that you just described that you have? And what's their role around instruction? So this is a two-part question. And Doug, I'm going to ask you to start with the response on this one. What's the role of leaders in the midst of this?
Sure. And I think a lot of times principals interject themselves into the PLC and kind of manage it and control it because they're worried that the work's not going to get done. And I think the better role for school leaders is to create what I call activators of PLCs. Who is the person that can activate the learning and the conversations? A little bit of investment in a group of activators so that they have some facilitation skills, some dealing with difficult people skills, some group processing skills. That's where I would spend my time, is creating these activators who can get the PLC teams to engage in their work. I don't use the word facilitator because in the true definition of facilitation is you don't add stuff to the table. You're facilitating the work of other people. So activators are engaged in activating the collective work, which I think is super important. And then administrators don't have to be, like I'm a former English teacher, so I can join the conversation and contribute, but I don't have to be in charge of the PLC because there's activators in the English team or in the grade 9, 10 team or whatever team they're talking about. So I think that's super important. My role is to grow the leadership of the teachers so they can activate the groups out there. So here, those kinds of things. I think the other thing is setting some sacred time that teams can meet. And I think to answer the cynic who says, I don't have time for this, we all spend our time doing things we find valuable. And I can tell you, if you've been in the profession for a while, you have gone to a PLC meeting that was a complete waste of your time. And so when you say, I don't want to do this anymore, what you're really saying is, I don't want to waste time anymore. If I go to a team meeting and I get something out of it, I get ideas, I feel good about it, I contribute, I feel like I help my colleagues, I'm going to value this time in the future. So that's where we have to go as school leaders, is to grow those activators, we call them activators, and to support the teams in giving them time. So Shirley Hord had 6 conditions of PLCs to make them work. And one of them was around putting the structures in place. And one of them was about designing leadership inside the teams themselves and not taking over those teams. Now, in some PLC models, it's like there is no leadership, there is no facilitator, and some of those groups really flounder. They start talking about, like, let's plan a field trip or which books are we going to buy? And then the true teachers in that group say, I don't need to be part of this. It's a waste of my time.
Bryan, I can see what's on your...
Well, I was going to just say what I appreciate the most about my experiences within the PLC is that we created like a protocol of everyone's a participant and that everyone's there to share and everyone's there to learn. And with you make these norms as a group, and that builds that trust, that ability to share and feel like what you're sharing is beneficial for everyone else. And it's been neat to see the leaders in my school as equals, in the sense that we are all here to learn and we're all here to, benefit our kids ultimately in the end. And it's definitely, you got to get into the right mindset. And I think it's done with creating norms within a group and having clear protocols for how a discussion is brought about.
What I'm hearing from everyone is we need to be in the mindset of we're all in a cycle of continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. And that's just part of what it means to be in this profession. And also that it sounds like it's less work overall when you engage in a professional learning community that's an effective professional learning community, because at the end of the day, you're sharing best practices and overall decreasing your workload. But you have to invest in the steps in order to get to that point, is what I'm hearing. But Marnitta, what would you add to that? Because you're living it.
Absolutely. Just to add just that final piece is that, again, it's already been recorded, but we each have a really pivotal role. And there is no one voice that represents the whole voice of the group, or that quiets all of the rest of the voices or diminishes the voices of the team, and that we all collectively have a part to play here. And we're each necessary to make this work. So that piece has been definitely the difference between PLCs that I've been a part of that were really strong and really engaged, and we saw it through right to the end, versus those that, again, as Doug mentioned, those ones where you just don't even want to show up, or have those surly members, or we're all in a bad mood because no one really wants to be there. We feel like it's a waste of time. So that place where we all have a voice, we all participate, and we all know that we have work to do and that we're here to do it.
So I want to get more precise, and because the title of this webinar focuses on moving the needle on equity.
Yes.
And if we're talking about moving the needle, I think what we've talked about to this point is it gives us a reason for PLCs. We talked a little bit about the work that they might do and the reasons behind it. But can you start us down this path of, so how does all of this activity result in moving the needle on equity?
So I think we've heard a few things already. So if a teacher leaves and does his or her best job, but it's not effective, like the round robin reading example, you're contributing to the problem of equity. It's not on the kids, it's on the lack of quality instruction, or what in the research is called curriculum casualties. It's a casualty of the curriculum and experience. It's not the kid, right? It's the school. So that's one. Second, when you look at the conversation around the assignments are super important. And that's been shown since the opportunity gap documents came out, that kids are not being asked to do things that are rigorous in certain communities and appropriate. But I'll take it in a little different direction. I think every time a group of teachers meets together to talk about students' learning, there is a potential for them to address equity. But there's never been a PLC model that demanded a conversation about equity. It was an option. It might have occurred, but we need to say, as part of every single time a group of teachers comes together, they have to look at trend data. Now, what really happens in most PLCs is they look at who didn't learn it and they assign those kids to RTI. And there's become this link between PLC and RTI. And if you don't learn it, you go to intervention. And if you look at the rosters, and RTI works. I mean, if you look at the research on RTI, it works. It's got a very strong effect on students' learning, but it works for the right kids. Mm-hmm. And what I believe has happened, an unintended consequence of some of the PLC link to RTI, has been the rosters of intervention are growing. We're getting more kids to intervention. And if you look at the demographics of who's going to intervention, you can predict what they look like, which kids are going to intervention. And so I think what has happened in the PLC is, well, that kid didn't learn it, intervention. That kid didn't learn it, intervention. That kid didn't learn it, intervention. Rather than saying, what are the trends in who did not learn this and who did learn it? And what implication does that have for us as their teachers? If we see a huge systematic lack of learning of English learners, what are we doing about that now, rather than sending all of them to intervention? If students with disabilities, if Black kids or kids who speak Spanish at home, if girls didn't learn as well or boys didn't learn as well, do we ever look at the trend data, or are we living with individual kids going to intervention? And if we actually look at trend data, we start to say, well, what barriers could I remove for learning, or what opportunities to learn could I have provided, rather than putting all kids into intervention? What barriers were there in this kid's learning that I could remove, rather than simply saying they have to go to intervention and have potentially missing more of my class time while they go to intervention, especially in the elementary school systems? So when you get to barrier removal, and when you get to opportunities to learn, you start to think of the world in a different way to deliver on the promise of equity. That you start to say, there's a barrier here, and it could have been from the school system. How many minutes we allocate something, how we built our schedule. There's some evidence that in elementary school, you shouldn't fracture the literacy block. There shouldn't be interruptions in it. People have been publishing about this. And yet you look at some classes, because of a schedule and recess and stuff, some kids get an hour of literacy, then a break of some kind, recess or whatever, and then a block of literacy, whereas others get a full uninterrupted block. Just that structure could be a barrier to learning that had nothing to do with the students. If you look at the master schedule, if any principal shows me their master schedule, I will tell you what you believe about equity. Because the master schedule is about opportunities. And I believe school leaders should analyze their master schedule and figure out where the inequities exist. How do the teams deal with that in their daily conversations with each other?
Doug, let me ask you just a follow-up on that, because one of the barriers could be, I don't know what I need to do as a teacher in order to
That's
support.
correct.
And so what suggestion would you have when the barrier is the learning of the actual, or the need to learn something from the actual teacher?
Right. So hopefully you have connections to colleagues that you trust who can help you learn it. So rather than say, these kids need to go to intervention, I need to learn more about this, like my round robin reading. That is an ineffective way of developing reading comprehension. But if that's all you know, that's what you're going to use. Because I do believe teachers show up to do the best job they know how to do right now. That our job is to help them learn more effective ways of reaching kids. And so I think we have to engage in that. So I'm going to take us on a little bit of a connection here, tangent maybe. I don't think teams want members who are not effective with their kids. This is one of the challenges with PLCs, is almost always it's a marriage of convenience. Teams don't get to pick their teams. If you're a third grade teacher, you're on the third grade team. Nobody is looking for members to join the team whose kids are not learning from them. And so I think teacher credibility, do kids actually learn from teachers, is a prerequisite to effective PLCs. Because if I'm a team member, like Marnitta and Bryan, talented English teachers, but if there was a new person that came to our school who was not very good yet, our job is to grow that person's ability to impact kids so that we start to increasingly value their contributions to the group. There are people out there who are highly effective with their students, but are not very good at working with their colleagues. We have a little label, we call them talkers. Independent contractors. I'll come to talkers. They're independent contractors, and they are amazing with their kids. Leaders tend to leave these people alone because they're effective with kids. But I'm talking about this because of what Marnitta said earlier. Those folks create a toxic work environment for the other team members. They don't share, they don't interact. They can be outright hostile, but they're really good with their kids. Their kids learn a lot. So we leave them alone as their leaders. But what we don't realize is internal dynamics to the team's meeting. People start scheduling doctor's appointments to get away from that meeting. They'll do anything not to go to that meeting because we did not deal with it. The other person that's not effective on the team totally loves their colleagues, but is not effective with their kids. They're all talk. They don't create a toxic environment for the adults. They create a cynical environment for the adults. Because what starts to happen is, if that's good enough, if she's work is good enough, why am I working so hard? Mm-hmm. So all of that grown-up stuff plays out in how the kids experience school and learning. And if as leaders, if we don't deal with people who are really effective with kids but bad with their colleagues, or people who are all talk and don't actually impact their kids, we are creating teams that don't deliver. That is the inequity there that then plays out in students' learning.
So this
I think both of them have, sorry, Fred, I think both Bryan and Marnitta have examples of both those kinds of teachers, the one who's all talk and no action, and the one who's outright hostile but amazing with kids. We all know that, the superstar who cannot get along with other grown-ups.
And Doug, as we were talking, we began this line of the conversation with the equity issue. And I think everything you said hits very close to home for a lot of folks who are living PLCs and are living on the front lines in terms of working with students and making sure they have access to effective teaching and learning every day. And part of what you were getting at was this notion of how the expertise comes into the community, the learning community, and how that happens. And then also, how do you make sure that you're not sharing bad practices within the community, but you're actually infusing new ideas and innovative thinking around best practices. And so I'm going to start with you, Marnitta. You heard a lot of what Doug just said, and you're living this right now. But what would you add in terms of how this has played out in your environment? in making sure that you're meeting the needs of all children?
Doug mentioned looking at, of course, the results and the impact of the practices in the classroom. And then we have, again, that one who doesn't like to share. We have the one who, again, is all talk. And something that I really appreciate, and Bryan mentioned it earlier, is the practice of the micro teaching. And when that happens and is a shared, every person takes his or her turn to capture what goes on in the classroom and be in the hot seat with your colleagues and hear what your colleagues have to say, it switches things just a little bit, because again, the emphasis is not on how great that one person is. It's highlighting the goodness and the greatness in all of our classes, but it is also highlighting those areas of need that we all have, even that great teacher. And so when we employ practices that provide these shared experiences, that I believe is definitely that opportunity to help to build those equitable practices within a team.
And Bryan, one question, and I'm going to take a slight shift here because, and so you're the lucky person who gets this question with the shift, but we're in COVID-19 era now. And a lot of what we've been talking about for PLCs is, a lot of it translates to this new era in which we find ourselves engaging virtually. But I'm curious, how do you perceive everything that we've been talking about? And Doug, I'm going to come to you next on this one. Just how is it playing out for you, or how do you anticipate it playing out in this virtual world in which we find ourselves now?
Well, I mean, this happened and it was, explosive, and everything was kind of upended, and we at first was like just scrambling to get our bearings, but ultimately the tools that are available for all of us translates perfectly for this type of communication. Just as this Zoom recording right now, we're able to put this on and share with other people after the fact. I'm able to take the lessons that I have with my students and take segments out of it to just demonstrate what does it look like when I release the kids to work independently, or what does it look like when I'm modeling how to write an introduction paragraph or anything else like that. Those are things that just come to mind from immediately, but I think these tools are neat for in a way to capture what we're doing with our students, and a neat way for us to share with our colleagues and analyze the work and be reflective ultimately. But it just takes a little bit of 21st century knowledge and wherewithal. You gotta be able to explore these tools and have that time to understand how they're used and could benefit us.
Yeah, I don't think any of us would have ever guessed we would become this proficient in Zoom or whatever technology at this point. And Doug, I know you've seen lots of innovations when it comes to how schools are engaging in just, first of all, the act of teaching and learning, but also PLCs virtually, given these virtual platforms. What might you share?
So one of the interesting things we're in a PPLC. Some of you were part of the PPLC from Wallace. And in California, there are 10 districts involved in the PPLC. And we've been meeting and talking. Some of them, well-meaning, canceled all PLC meetings during the school closures and distance learning because they didn't want teachers to have to do one more thing. And others maintained their PLC movements, but virtually. And it turns out that the stress levels were actually lower in places where they maintained the PLCs. Because all of a sudden, people were in their homes, not able to connect to their colleagues, but still feeling a pressure to teach kids. And teacher stress increases when we don't feel that we're effective in reaching. Most of us are used to what we call compassion satisfaction, that by helping others, in this case students, we feel really good about ourselves. That's why we got into this profession. We like compassion satisfaction. But we started to get compassion fatigue, and we didn't have a way to talk to other people because in some systems they canceled grade level, PLC departments and things like that. And stress went up because they didn't have their natural system of support of their peers to problem solve. And so everybody's left to their own. And I understand it was well intended because we didn't want to add one more thing during this crisis. But it turns out it was pretty protective in the districts that continued their PLCs. So I'm encouraging folks as we return to school, and whatever school looks like, blended, half days, distance, who knows, we have to maintain teacher connections to their peers. And as Bryan was saying, we have protocols and systems and ways of working that have been proven effective. And I think if we can maintain that, we can help teachers think about the connections they have, the impact they're having on kids, and get some of those early wins. Our agency is part of our turnover or burnout issue. So if we don't feel that our efforts are having any impact, our agency decreases and we're very likely to burn out. When we believe that our efforts are having an impact, our agency increases. When that happens as a collective, then collective efficacy grows. So if an individual, so let's say Bryan is trying to reach a bunch of his kids and he can't do it and they're not succeeding and he's trying things, his agency starts to decline and he becomes at risk of burnout. But if he's part of a team and he says to his team in a trusted way, wow, I only have 50% of my kids showing up. Only 50% are doing this. How are you all reaching kids? And we have a brainstorm and they give him ideas and he tries some of them and a week later comes back and says, here are the things I tried. Here's what happens. His agency goes up. Mm-hmm. And I think we forgot that in this crisis is we have to keep our professional connections because it is protective for our health.
I like that.
And important. And Marnitta, I'm sure in the virtual PLC conversations you've had, that's been a part of your experience. Can you add a practical example to what Doug just shared?
Just the simple piece here. We've shared navigating the Zoom resource. Imagine the first time you have to navigate back and forth through Zoom, learn how to record it, learn how to set up the breakout sessions. We were able to practice those skills as a team, give a shared responsibility as the host. And just that simple practice, again, help to build that capacity to lead the instruction with our students and be confident and aware of what we're doing and at what time. And so just those simple moments where, again, we think about the fact that we are a team. We don't have a voice that is the only voice that quiets all the rest of ours. And so simple as being the host of a Zoom session has made tremendous impact in the way that we lead and instruct our classes.
Fred, let me jump in and brag on Marnitta and Bryan for just a second. They were teaching right after we closed school, and they decided to do these watch parties with kids, and they would do a shared watch of a Netflix, and then they could do live chat through this system. I didn't even know that was possible to do a shared watch of Netflix and live chat during it. But imagine these kids in their homes away from their loved teachers and these teachers coming on, and we're all gonna do a watch party together, film as literature, and we're gonna chat and we're gonna pause it every once in a while and have conversations. Just the creativity and the commitment and the team coming together to have these conversations is just, it's so powerful. Just those little things like that can make a big difference for all of us and our students.
I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of watch parties popping up all over the country right now. There's a lot of just that statement. You know, one of the things as we come to the end of our time together, so right now, Learning Forward is facilitating this revision of the standards for professional learning. And part of what we've been talking about is all connected to professional learning and what should be best practices. And I'm wondering, as you think about, if you could make a suggestion or offer some advice to what would you like to see appear in a set of standards around professional learning that will guide the field in terms of what effective professional learning should look like, based on the conversation that we just had, the work that you're doing, the effective PLCs that you have in place. I'm going to come to you, Bryan, first and ask what one piece of advice, and Marnitta, I'm giving you the heads up, I'm coming to you next, and then we'll end with Doug. What piece of advice would you offer those who are revising those standards right now?
There's definitely a need for norms within a group. I think if you're able to create norms that everyone can agree on and protocols that works for the team, then you're able to build that trust and you're able to share your practice with others. It's an intimate process, but it's important to be able to invite others into what you do within your classroom or within your Zoom session. And I think if you create some sort of normalcy amongst that, then everyone's able to kind of flourish or able to explore that together.
Yeah, that's a nice reminder that people don't automatically just start acting like this amazing PLC on day one. It takes use of protocols and norms, and you practice that, and then you become more proficient as a community. So appreciate that. Marnitta, what would you add?
Standards for reflective practices. And so where are we now? Where are we going? And everything that's in between, right? So just that time to definitely be reflective before we can get to the place of planning and creating.
So not just doing it, moving on to the next thing, but actually looking back and making the connection between our conversation, our work, and the impact it's had on our practice, as well as our students, is what I'm hearing from.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And Doug, what advice would you offer?
Well, I really like what Marnitta said, because last year we did a study of reflection. It turns out most people summarize, not reflect. So I think that's a really good reminder of actually teaching reflection. I would hope that the standards also say that there's an expectation that when we learn, we look at the impact that we have on groups and trends for equity, that it's no longer just individual kids, it's trend data. Are we actually impacting groups of students who need us most? And I think that equity has to become part of our standards for professional learning. That is a part of our goal system, our belief system, and our values. I also think we need to be clear on the role that administrators play in the professional learning communities, and not taking them over, but supporting the work of teachers.
That's great. That's wonderful advice from all members of this panel. And because you all have so much expertise, and because you're all reading, and you were talking about, Bryan and Marnitta, some of the books that have been part of your learning community. One of the participants was asking, what are you all reading? What are some of the books that you're reading, either as part of your learning community or as part of your own professional learning? So I would love for you each to share maybe one thing that you're reading that folks might want to add to their summer reading list. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bryan, jump in there.
Stamped. I can't remember the author right now. I hope maybe Marnitta, you do, or.
Yeah, Jason Reynolds and Ibram X was that one, yeah.
I really enjoyed that one.
All right, so we'll add that one to the list. Marnitta, what would you add?
The PLC Plus playbook has been really, really helpful for our team development and practices, for sure.
Nice. And Doug, I'm guessing you read a book or two in the last.
Right. Yes. We, as our school, we've all got Beverly Tatum's second edition of her book, where all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria. And so that's been, to revisit that after, I think it was 20 years later, she did the second edition. So that's been really interesting to revisit that. I had that book in graduate school. And so now as the entire school, we all have that book now. So that's been an interesting one. And I think we're all working on distance learning right now. As I think about it, distance learning will be part of fall if it, in some way. If we go A/B, if we go completely distance, if we go to school and then there's an outbreak and we have to go away, I think we all need to grow our skills on distance learning.
So we are near the end of our time, and I'm going to give you each just one chance to make a final farewell statement. And I'm going to ask you to also be thinking about a question that came up from one of our participants, and that has been really appreciating the discussion around PLCs and its connection to instruction. But there was a wondering that we may be missing the opportunity to think of PLCs, equity in school systems, and its value beyond instruction. So as you make your final comment, and we'll go in the order that we just went of Marnitta, Bryan, and then Doug, just final thoughts on everything that we talked about today and any comments around this notion of the value of PLCs beyond instruction.
Yes.
Again, when we think about this collective group who shares experiences, is transparent with one another, and has a shared vision, definitely when we think beyond the classroom, we're able to take a moment to, again, ask those tough questions, really explore and invest time and energy into the entire school environment, right? What do we put on our wall? What do we say to students when they walk through the door? What types of behaviors happen in between classrooms? These are all conversations that definitely impact what happens in the classroom, but take place outside of the classroom. And so that shared, trusted environment helps to navigate those discussions.
Oh, those are great examples. Thank you, Marnitta. Bryan, what would you add?
A shared community in which, you know, we all are experiencing this profession together, and we all come at it with different lenses and different background experiences. And so having that support system in order to call upon, you know, at a moment's notice is an important thing that I value.
Thank you, Bryan. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate both you, Bryan and Marnitta, for your contribution to this conversation as you are doing this work in school right now. So thank you so much. And then Doug, as you bring it home here, what's the last thing that you would add to this conversation?
So I would add that we should support and trust teachers to do this work. It's important work, and it's teachers' work. They need support and our trust as leaders to do this work. Now, in terms of equity, I hope we did not imply that the only way to realize the dreams of equity is to focus on instruction. I think instruction is one way, but every time a group of teachers gets together, they have the potential for addressing equity, including noticing bias, including noticing structural racism, structural prejudice. They have the potential to talk about the choices of literature, as an example, that allow windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors for children. Every decision that team makes could foster the equity goals or hinder them. So yes, instruction is important. It's how we move learning forward. But I think probably the most important PLC question we could ever ask is who benefited and who did not. And if we actually look at the trends of who benefited from our work and who did not, we are faced with the data that are hiding in plain sight. And then we can take action.
Very powerful, Doug. And Bryan and Marnitta. Doug, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise, your experience. This has been a great conversation, and I just really applaud the work that you're doing. And I know you all are looking forward to your virtual start to the school year. So I wish you all a great beginning of the school year, and may it be a wonderful experience for all of your children. So again, thank you so much. And thank you to all who joined us for this webinar. We hope you'll join our next webinar on June 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, as Jill Baker, who's the superintendent of Long Beach Unified School District, discusses her experience of assuming the superintendency in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you exit, please take a moment to complete our survey to help guide the development of future webinars in this series. Again, thank you all. Take care and have a wonderful afternoon.